Hey everyone, my name is Valeria Contreras and I am the Advocacy Director for A Plus Colorado. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of school finance with two great people, and I will allow them to introduce themselves. So if you all could please introduce yourself, the organization that you work for, and your position, please.
Les, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Caldwell. I'm the Vice President for Education Initiatives at the Colorado Children's Campaign. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization. We've been around for 35 years, and we primarily work in the issues of K-12 education, early childhood health, and family economic security.
Awesome. And I'm Prateek Democrats. I work for DFER, Democrats for Education Reform, and I'm a policy director here at the Colorado chapter. And our committee works within the Democratic Party to make sure education, and more specifically equity in education, stays at the forefront of the agenda. We do this both politically by recruiting and supporting Democratic candidates to run in local, state, federal levels. And we also do this by pushing policy at the state and federal level that makes it education more equitable for all students.
Thank you both for being here today and sharing your expertise with us. Our first question is, how and why did you get involved with school finance?
Go for it, Prateek.
Awesome. Well, I could answer this in a couple of different ways. I mean, first, I'll speak organizationally. Our job is to fight the status quo and to make education more equitable for kids. And I mentioned that previously. We can't have equity in education without having an equitable funding formula. A school system is only as equitable as how it funds its schools. The funding formula, in my opinion, is like a real sign of how a state believes is the best way to allocate scarce resources to serve its students. In Colorado, I think we do a poor job of that. So, I can talk more about that later, but I think if we believe in equity, we have to talk about the funding formula.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my answer would be sort of personal. So I started my career as a sixth grade teacher in Los Angeles. And so, sort of experienced the importance of resources firsthand and really saw the difference between what my students had in our classroom versus the educational experience that I knew that kids were getting in other parts of the city that tended to be more affluent. And, I would come back to Colorado and people would ask me like, whoa, what's it like to teach in LA? It must be so hard. And what was interesting when I was a teacher is when I actually looked at the data on disparities and outcomes in achievement, in graduation, you name it. Here in Colorado, we actually have some of the largest gaps. So, like if you're looking at the college attainment gap between our white students and our Latinx students, or like third grade reading scores, we have some of the largest gaps in the country. And so, I've really spent the last 10 years since I was a teacher, like really trying to understand what's the infrastructure of inequity in our system. Where do these persistent racial gaps come from? Why do we have such an uneven playing field for kids by the time they leave high school? And the answer that I come back to over and over and over again is our school finance system. We have almost on purpose built a system, and in some ways not on purpose, but we have a system that almost makes sure that our communities with students that have the highest needs get the scarcest level of resources. And to Prateek's point, like it's wrong. And, the Children's Campaign is also really committed to pushing against that and creating a better system.
Thank you both for that. I love that personal experiences have shaped us in the work that we're doing now as adults. Second question is, where does funding for schools come from and how does it make its way to students?
I can try to take this one. So I kind of think of the answer to this in like layers in the system. So we have several structural problems that have resulted from provisions in our Constitution that have over time created really deep inequities in the way that we fund schools. And so, I would start with kind of the first layer of where does the money come from, which is from local property tax. So we have a wildly inequitable property tax system in the state where some taxpayers, depending on what school district they live in, they might pay a property tax rate that is 16 times higher than sometimes the neighboring school district. And there's no good reason for that. It's kind of an unintended consequence of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights or TABOR over time. But what happens is, the state looks at what is the amount of revenue that is raised through property tax, and then the state backfills whatever is not raised locally. And so, so the base property tax rates is kind of problem or layer number one. And then the state does its best through our funding formula to equalize for what is raised locally. And so we have a very complex 26-year-old school funding formula. And I think the problem with that is if you think about everything that's changed in the last quarter century, there's a lot. We've seen dramatic changes in our student population. We know that there's been innovations in the way that instruction is delivered and technology in the classroom. And then we also have all of these requirements that have changed in our policy systems. And so none of the changes that have happened in education really align with the way that we allocate dollars through school finance. We have a formula that is very much based on district characteristics. So things like cost of living, so sending a lot of money to districts where it's expensive to live versus districts that are serving students living in poverty. And so it looks a lot at district characteristics and not so much at like individual student learning needs and driving funding that way. So that's sort of problem number two. Problem number three then would be mill levy overrides. So this is a second layer of revenue that exists in the system where districts can go to their local voters and they can ask for additional property tax revenue. If they want to give teachers raises or improve their curriculum or get new buses, they have to ask their voters for that funding. Because we've seen so many statewide funding cuts over the last decade, this is now kind of the only solution that's available to school districts, is to go to their local voters. And so instead of one statewide solution, we have kind of 178 local solutions. The problem with that is that we know that funding, which is now, upwards of $1.4 billion raised through overrides statewide, we know that funding doesn't benefit all students equally. There are 52 school districts that have no mill levy override dollars. And then we have some districts that have $3,000 or $4,000 per student in additional funding. So that is a sort of a third layer of inequity that I would talk about. And we know that high property wealth districts in particular have an easier time raising money. They have a high property tax base. Often they have willing voters that want to support their schools. So, those are sort of like three ways that I would point out, here's how we raise the money and here's how we allocate it. And across all of those layers, we have problems with inequity and inadequacy.
Yeah, if I could add just a couple of quick points. Leslie, as always, just does just a fantastic job of explaining it, but I want to just really focus on a couple of things she mentioned. Right now, after the base formula that is decided by the state legislature, and there's Amendment 23 that makes sure the base goes up, by inflation. After that, the most important factors for funding are how expensive of a district you live in and the size of that district. Like, it's hard to comprehend how backwards and how antiquated and how bizarre that system is, right? It doesn't talk about what the needs of the students of that district are, not the concentration of poverty, not what the percentage of special education students, not those that are English language learners. It just talks about, hey, is your district very expensive to live in? well, we should actually give you money because the thought is it might be harder for you to recruit and retain personnel like teachers. So we have a system where we're actually funding richer districts more for being rich. I'm sorry, that's probably not the most politically correct way to say that, but that's the biggest factor. About $1.3 billion out of the $7.5 billion school finance goes to just cost of living. Another 350 or 400 million goes to size, meaning if you're a small district, you can't necessarily adapt some of the economies of scale. So we get money for that. But I'm not necessarily saying this should be none of that. Absolutely, smaller districts have special hardships, and absolutely, there's some resort communities that it must be hard to recruit and retain teachers. But right now, we have a system where we spend 4 times more money, 3.5 to 4 times more money on cost of living than we do on low-income students, based on the funding formula. That's I mean, honestly, I couldn't come up with a more backwards funding formula, even if I tried. It needs to change. And another small thing that Leslie mentioned all the big levers of inequity. A smaller level of inequity, but an inequity nonetheless, is what we have, our organizations both collectively have worked on it's called private fundraising, right? Whether it's PTAs, PTOs, or through foundations. A lot of small fundraisers, I don't think they're small dollars, but relatively to some of these inequities, they're smaller. They're not transparent. So a school with the PTO can have maybe a silent auction, raises $10,000, $20,000 to help provide a para in 1 classroom or 2 classrooms, whereas a school even down the street might not be able to afford that. Their parents might not be able to afford that. That's another layer of inequity. So the 3 different layers of inequity Les mentioned, I would add the 4th layer of inequity, which is private fundraising for wealthier families, wealthier schools. And they build off of each other. And so a system, I think, what we believe is that the state should come in and equalize, help make the place more equitable. My worry is that we're actually perpetuating the problem by all the things that Les mentioned, and also by having a funding formula that perpetuates the problem rather than help solve it.
Thank you both for that. Just to take this funding a little bit further, I know this is probably going to be a heavy question, but how would you all say that COVID has impacted funding and budgeting for schools?
You want to start on that one, Prateek?
I can do a quick overview, and Wes, if you want to talk more about let's say that maybe the big cuts last year, maybe some of the CARES dollars, I would like to almost take a 30,000-foot level of this and say, we talked about inequities in the previous question. This has supercharged those inequities. What I mean by that, it's now evident to all that not only is our funding formula adequate, we can see firsthand now the digital divide. We can see now that we need to provide more resources to those that are in need. And it can't go back to necessarily what it was before. We need to provide and deliver those resources to the highest needs communities, or else, honestly, we might never come back. As I say, we might lose an entire generation of students if we don't adequately respond to this. So as far as how it's affected public school finance, Les can do an excellent job of, I think, talking through some of the percentages. The federal money, we're hoping for another round of stimulus. I think with the change in administration, we hope that could, again, focus more on K-12 education. We got about $500 million last year. We need more. And not only do we need it more, we need to allocate them equitably. So Les, is that fair? Can I hand that off to you?
Yeah. No, I think all of that is right. Just to put some numbers on this too, I think it's maybe helpful to look at what the picture was even pre-COVID, because it's not like we were killing it on the school funding front then either. We even pre-COVID, Colorado sat at about $2,700 per pupil below the national average. And so, when you look at teacher salaries and take into account wage competitiveness, Colorado is like dead last in the country. So, we're always kind of in the bottom 10 states, bottom quartile, depending on what measure you're looking at. we, over the last few years, our legislature, within those constitutional constraints that I mentioned earlier, like the legislature had made some incremental progress in K-12 investment, but all of that has been wiped out by the COVID pandemic. We have something in the state called it's called the budget stabilization factor. It was formerly called the negative factor. This is something that was created by the legislature in the last recession in order to meet, sort of a ninja move to like meet our constitutional requirements for spending in K-12. But it's essentially an annual funding cut to schools. And when we add that up over the last decade, it's about $9.3 billion that should have been spent on schools across the state and students that we just haven't. We have not made that investment over the last 10 years. The annual amount of that factor or that cut was $572 million last year. This year, it's more than $1 billion. And so, that annual funding cut had to more than double just as a result of the pandemic in March. We did, the legislature was thankfully able to protect funding for some critical programs like, early literacy and school lunch programs and things like that. But we had a lot of other grant programs that have been hard won over the last 10 years that were scaled back considerably or just eliminated altogether. I think to end this maybe question on a high note, there was some good news in this election cycle. So voters in Colorado did pass Amendment B, which repealed something called the Gallagher Amendment. That has created a lot of the constraints that we've seen for K-12 finance. So that is now out of the Constitution. And they also passed Proposition EE, which devotes some funding to K-12 schools over the next 3 years. And then over time, it's going to create a universal preschool program for all kids in Colorado. So those are two really positive developments in the last election cycle. But we do, our legislators are going to have a lot of work to do to build us back, even just to where we were pre-pandemic, which still was not, I would even call that a dire situation.
I'm just like, wow, but thank you for sharing that. Prateek, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, it is. I mean, I appreciate Les's like optimistic view. Like there's definitely some good things happening. I will say, and Les mentioned this, I think I mentioned this before, it's not going to be enough to go back to where we were, right? It just can't, because where we were before was incredibly inequitable. COVID obviously supercharged some of these inequities, but to say, let's go back to where we were, it can't be, we can't go back to that, because that itself, right, as Les mentioned before, some of those just glaring disparities in graduation rates and reading levels, all of that, that was pre-COVID, right? And so after COVID, we can't say, hey, how can we go back to that state of being, because that state wasn't good enough. And so I hope we're going to have some brave legislators, advocacy groups who can now use this moment and really rethink some of these systems. I think the funding formula is absolutely one piece of that, but we hope we can just kind of root and branch, really examine all these systems, because we can't just go back to where we used to be, because where we used to be honestly wasn't that great.
Thank you. In thinking about like how complicating, let me say it again. I'm like, Mary, sorry, I'm restarting. Thank you both again for those answers. In thinking about how complicated school finance is, you all are talking about formulas that were created 20 plus years ago and so on. Even myself as a former educator, I didn't really always understand exactly how school finance worked. And even now, I would not say I'm anywhere near being an expert. With all that being said, what would you all say is the importance of community getting involved in school finance, and how can they get involved? Because it's something that's really important. And I would argue that I think community voices are often left out of decisions being made regarding school finance and budgeting.
I can take a stab at it, Les, and I'll let you drive it. I guess the biggest thing I would like to say is that, and this is no shade to legislators or elected officials at all, in the least bit, but those that created the system are not necessarily any more prepared or any more well-trained than community members who are living it. The system was created by people, by legislators. In 1994, they came up with a system that they believed was the best way to serve kids. That system is no longer adequate. And so I guess to answer your question, I think part of it is designed to seem complicated. Part of it's designed to seem hard to penetrate, because that's the way power and inequities perpetuate themselves. They perpetuate themselves when common people, average working people, look at a system like, wait, that's just too complicated. I don't think I want to be involved in that. Allowing for a small group of people to continue to benefit. So I would like to answer the question by saying it's actually, this sounds a little, negative or almost paternalistic. It's actually not that complicated. If they could figure it out, if they could create it, we can figure it out and we can reform it. And so I would ask people, those that are listening, to really engage and reach out to Les or myself if they want a thought partner, because that's the way those empower, that's the way systems benefit, when people who don't understand kind of give up and think it's just too complicated. It's too hard. The smart people, they're the ones who figure it out. No, there's no smart people. It's all of us. We all came up with this. It was created by average people, and it can be dismantled by average people. But we do need people in the rooms. We need people engaging. And our organization's happy to work with anybody, any parent, any organization that wants to reform this to make it better serve kids. But I would urge, like, all people, don't think it's too complicated to engage. It's not. It was made by average folks. It can be dismantled by average folks.
Woohoo! I totally agree with all of that, Prateek. And just in terms of like, why is it important to engage on this issue? There are so many important issues in education, obviously, but Prateek said this at the beginning, like, resource allocation is the clearest statement on like who we are and what we value, I think. And the way that our school finance system works and the way that resources are allocated across the state, like, really truly is the foundation of inequity in the system. And I believe all of the disparities that we see in our system are a result of our resource allocation. So totally agree with Prateek's points on just really important for policymakers to hear from real people about their experiences and their kids' experiences, or if you're a student, your own experience in the system, and what are the things that you have or don't have access to in your educational experience. In terms of like ways to get involved, every school district is required to report financial information and post it to their website. I will not be the first to say that those are like super user-friendly systems, but I think that it is, and it should be totally acceptable for folks to reach out to your child's principal or a district administrator and see if they would be willing to meet with you and other parents to explain how the layers of revenue work in the system, and how does the formula work for your school district, and what do they think the problems are with school finance. I think some levers for change really do exist at the district level. So when we're talking about how districts spend their money at the district administrative level, or interventions that they provide for groups of students district-wide or per school, like, those are really district level spending decisions. And then there are advocacy levers at the state level, which is what Prateek and I collaborate on a lot. So this is sort of like when we talk about the big picture of how our funding formula works and where we should be driving money based on what the research says. That is more of a state level conversation, but there are ways to plug into all of that. And I think the most important thing and what it all comes back to is lived experience in the system. And what is it that you see your kid or what do you need to get a great educational experience? And how is your school meeting that need or not meeting that need?
Thank you. I think you both kind of were touching on this a little bit, but is there anything specifically that your organization or group does to make school finance accessible to parents, students, or community, or ways for them to directly get involved?
So at the Children's Campaign, it's a great question because, like Prateek said, like this is one of our state systems that feels often needlessly complicated. And it's very easy to like throw your hands up and say like, I don't know how any of this works. And so at the Children's Campaign, we try to demystify this as much as we can. In a normal summer and fall, I would be traveling all over the state to give presentations, meet with school leaders, community groups, just to talk about how school finance works and try to tailor that presentation for that community. So we're always happy to do that whenever it's helpful. I will sit down one-on-one with anyone and walk through these how this works. So definitely, reach out to me anytime. We have a weekly newsletter called Kids Flash, and that is where we have, over time, we've published a lot of different articles about school finance. Again, trying to like demystify pieces of this. We've done podcasts and videos about various aspects of the school funding system. And then, we're a policy organization that's working at the Capitol. So we work in coalition with DFER and a ton of community-based groups. And we're always trying to elevate the experiences of those who are most impacted by policy change in these conversations. And so, those are just like some of the ways that I would say the Children's Campaign is trying to make this complicated topic more accessible, but we're also always open to feedback on other things that would be helpful.
I will quickly say that our organization is a statewide policy organization focused mostly on influencing lawmakers and elected officials. We sometimes believe, when it comes to speaking to community, we believe some of the community organizations that are already built up, that are already created, are the best vehicles to do that. And we work in tandem with other organizations. We don't necessarily believe we're a community-facing organization, but we do work side by side, hand in glove with a lot of community organizations that do the work. And Les mentioned some of the things that they do, and we're fully in support of that. We work with a lot of other community organizations, but our organization mostly works at what we call the grass tops level with elected officials and policymakers. We try not to step on the toes of the incredible community organization that's happening with so many different organizations. But we do work with them and try to empower them best we can on these topics and anything education related.
Thank you both. I want to just thank you both for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. I would also encourage anyone viewing the video that if you want to learn more or support the Children's Campaign or DFER, you can please visit their websites. We will post those on the blurb because I think it's easier to click on something versus me naming the website. And if Leslie and Prateek are open to it, we can also post their emails if you all want to get in contact with them and if you have any other questions or directly want to get involved with school finance. But thank you both again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Valeria. This was fun. Thank you.